So our next speaker is someone from our local community that you might know, Tamara Griffiths. She is a permaculture designer, an educator, an activist and a historian. She grew up in the township of Whyalla in South Australia where, in her words, there was a lot of violence. Tamara has a diverse professional life. She has a master's in public history, that is the history of public places, from Monash University. She's worked as a historian and an educator to the public on World War I for the Melbourne Museum, in addition to contributing historical research to various archaeological projects. She also played an important role working with Aboriginal Affairs, collating the Cultural Heritage Register, recording historical sites, in particular those sites in Australia where massacres of Aboriginal people took place. Tamara completed the Permaculture Design Certificate in 2007 and undertook a 10-month internship with Bill Mollison, the co-originator of permaculture. Currently, Tamara runs the Forest Edge Permaculture Nursery in Callista, and I think that's where we might know her from. Welcome, Tamara.
Hi everyone, I'm just going to press start on my timer.
Oh, okay. Good one.
And as I was sitting there, my knees started to shake. And it's been a long time since my knees have shook when I was speaking publicly. So, okay, lots of you do know me. And for those who don't, hello, it's nice to meet you. People who do know me and know my online activities, I'm a bit of a ranter, and it's generally around, well, duck shooting. But a few years ago, I started following the Red Heart campaign online and also Destroy the Joint. And both of these Facebook groups, they count dead women. So Destroy the Joint counts women who were murdered. The Red Heart campaign counts women who have either been murdered or have died from manslaughter. So this year, that website also included men. It's included children as well. So it's now the only site in Australia that records the murders and manslaughters of men, women and children across Australia. So anyone who's seen me sharing any of that stuff, a few years ago, it was probably my peak anger time and the most caps lock and the most swearing. I'm a very well-known swearer. And there was a period just after Eurydice Dixon was murdered. So she was the young woman who was walking home through a park in Carlton, and she was raped and murdered. Now the young man that did that is now in jail. But at the time, there were a few things that were happening. So I had been following the Facebook counting, and every week there'd be another dead woman. Sometimes there were no weeks, and I'd be like, yes! I was actually happy that there were no weeks. And then with unfortunately, those weeks never lasted very long. And then sometimes there would be a group of murders. And so when Eurydice Dixon was murdered, one thing that a lot of women recall from the time is that one of the policemen in charge of the case said that women need to have situational awareness. And myself and my fellow online feminists, but also just average women, was like, no, hang on. Yes, we have learned our entire life. Don't walk through the park. Don't go out at night. Don't get raped. And this policeman said women should have situational awareness. And that was kind of the last straw for a lot of us. And we actually said, no, it's not about us and our behaviour. It's actually about the person who is perpetrating the rape. So it's not my fault. It is not my fault, even if I'm walking home through a park. It's not my fault that I'm raped. The fault lies with the man that is doing the raping and the murdering. So there was a little bit of change. I feel there was a bit of change among women. And I did actually get a sore arm from a bit too much stuff. And I remember really distinctly, there was a friend of mine who's really progressive young man. And he wrote, women have never been safe. And I lost the plot. That was the absolute end of it. Women have never been safe. Okay, well, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be safe now. So that's a brief introduction to my sweariness on Facebook, and also kind of where I'm coming from tonight. And I think that counting the deaths radicalised me. Having said that, I grew up in a mining town in South Australia. It was a BHP town. It was a particularly violent place. Luckily for me, I had a radical lesbian feminist aunt who was also an environmentalist, and I escaped Whyalla at 17 and a half, and I haven't really looked back. So part of the reason that I don't look back, and I do talk about Whyalla a lot, because it created who I am, and it's also a foil for me as a permaculture teacher and gardener and greenie and activist and feminist. You know, they weren't normal things to do in Whyalla. So my role tonight is to bring a personal perspective on violence and women. And I brought my keys up. After Eurydice Dixon was murdered, there were some things that were posted about things that women do but that men don't know about. And who knows this one? Yeah. When you go to self-defense class, this is the first thing they teach you. Because if someone's attacking you, I've never had to use it, but I've used my keys in my hands more than 100 times. And that's because I felt unsafe. I might not have actually been unsafe, but I felt unsafe. And that's something that happens to women a lot as well. 12 minutes, okay. So my story starts when I'm 15, and I'm a sweet young thing. And I met this young man who was also 15, and we started going out. And when I turned 16, I started having sex with him. So, which was rather good, actually, I have to say, and that's probably why you put up with stuff. Anyway, I was 16. Went out with this young man for a good, I'd say more than 6 months, maybe 8 months. Now, in that time, it was a volatile relationship. There were arguments. There was smashing of plates. There was bruises on my arms that looked like fingers and thumbs, which I told my friends and family were from the saucepans at work, because I worked in a kitchen. So anyway, I think people kind of knew what was going on, but they also kind of didn't. So I eventually broke up with this young man probably a couple of months into year 12. And when we look at the stats about violence against women, and also when women are murdered and children are murdered, it's in that time after breakup that is the most dangerous for women and children. So anyway, it for some reason it escalates. Now, I had tried to leave him before. I'm 16 at this stage, by the way. I tried to leave him before, but he threatened to kill himself. And when someone's threatening to kill themselves, you can't leave them, because then it's your fault that they've killed themselves. So, especially for a 16-year-old. So, anyway, right, we broke up. He started beating up my male friends. He beat up one of my boyfriends. He stalked me. He used to be in my front yard. He came to a party that I was having and threatened to put a pitchfork through the front window. And at this point, I was hiding in a wardrobe, and everyone else was like, "No, she's not here." Anyway, right. So, my parents, their wedding anniversary is in May, and every year they go away. Now, Jonathan, that's his name, he knew that my parents would be away, and he also knew that I was staying at home. I was 16 by this, actually just turned 17 at this stage. Mum and Dad trusted my brother and I to be home alone. You know, we wouldn't do anything silly, that sort of thing. Anyway, he knew my parents were away. The other thing he knew, we had a keypad on our front door. You know the code? He knew the code. Now, I didn't think anything of him knowing that code until I was in bed one night, and Jonathan used the code and came into my bedroom. So when people say, "What were you wearing?" I nearly wore some pyjamas underneath so I could show you what I was wearing. I was wearing my pyjamas and my nightie. And now I'm 17 at this stage. Now, this is where it gets hard for me, because he agreed to leave if I had sex with him. So I had sex with him. And then he didn't leave. And then all hell broke loose. Like, I lost my temper. I really, absolutely lost it. I picked up the phone to ring the police. He left. I went to school the next day, and I went straight to my homeroom teacher and I told her what had happened. And she was quite concerned. And I told her, and then I went out to the foyer, and Jonathan walks up and he says, "I've just spoken to my homeroom teacher too. She says that because you had sex with me in the past, it means it was all right." Who knows if this woman actually said that? She may or may not. Attitudes 20 years ago, they're not so much different to now. But but that was, you'd had sex with him before. This was not rape. Now, in my mind, until only a few years ago when I wrote it on the Me Too post, I had called it sex without my permission. Sex without my permission. Or even, actually, it was sex with my permission, because I had said yes and I had done it. So where does that leave you as a rape victim? It was very hard. Now, when people say, "Why don't you go to the police?" Okay, that's the first one. Was, you know, in people's minds, is it rape if you've had sex with someone to get them to leave your house? Clearly it is, yes. you're under duress. Secondly, the thought of going to the police and ending up in court, and at 17, having to talk about what had happened to you, that was absolutely not going to happen. Thirdly, and this is to do with the shame, is that, Mum and Dad may well have figured out that I was having sex, but he threatened to tell my parents that we were having sex if I told anyone about it. So the shame of being a 17-year-old, you can't go to the police, you can't tell your parents because of the shame. It was a bit rough, I have to say. Just trying to think what happened after that. It's been a very long time. And a few years ago when the Me Too thing happened, I was able to write it down and press send. And that was a fairly liberating moment. And it was like, yes, me too. I have been raped. I'm going to call it rape. So I've been seeing my psychiatrist for about 15 years. And one of the things I fantasised about for many, many years was breaking all of Jonathan's bones with a baseball bat and burning his body in the bush. And I remember telling my psychiatrist this because I'd figured out that I was absolutely a very, very, very bad person because I'd thought about this so much. He said to me, well, have you done it? And I said, well, no. He says, well, that's the bit that doesn't make you a bad person. Sometimes our responses to what we've been through, it does make us want to hurt someone as much as they've hurt you. I thought I'd include that bit, don't know why, but so I've got 3.5 minutes left. Thank you for all the stats. They're wonderful. And it's actually really important for me as a woman who's an activist online to be able to say, actually, this, 1 in 3 women in Australia has been sexually assaulted. Now, when the Me Too thing happened and we all started talking to each other, we all realised it's actually not 1 in 3 and it's actually 9 in 10. And it's remarkably common, but it's the shame that stops us talking about it to each other, and it's the fear of being judged, it's the fear of being called a slut, it's the fear of someone saying, well, you'd had sex with him, so you asked for it, which is what I was told at the time. So I'd like to thank all of the people, men and women, who have been sexually assaulted and who have told their story, because it's a brave thing to do, and it's important if we're going to have change, really important if we're going to have change. Let's see. What I'd like to see is next year or the year after, instead of 1 murder of a woman a week, I'd like to see maybe 1 a fortnight, and then maybe I'd like to see 1 a month. I wouldn't like to see it, but geez, it would be good to get it down there. And maybe one day we'll get to a point where the murder of women isn't done, and that the murder of women isn't okay. I'd like to thank you all for listening, and I really appreciate that you're all here. Thank you. you.